Thank you. Testing 1, 2, 3. Thank you. You know, I dreamed for decades about writing a book, and I thought it would just be the greatest thing to write a book and walk into a bookstore and see the book that I had written. And when I found that my office is in New York on Rockefeller Center on 6th Avenue, and when I heard that the book had shown up in the Barnes & Noble, because we don't have pals in Manhattan, in the Barnes & Noble on 5th Avenue, I made my way over there, and I walked in, and I found my book, and I immediately was so disappointed because it wasn't on one of these tables. I think that you can dream about something, and when you get it, my satisfaction lasted about as long as a Beatles song from like the early Beatles, before they started singing long songs, because immediately I just began thinking about what was wrong and how unhappy I was. And so I'm so happy to be at Pals where they're giving it terrific table space. It's the first time I've seen it, and I really appreciate it. When I told people that I was working on this book, I could tell that they were thinking two things. Steve must really know a lot of math and data stuff, A, and B, at some point I'm probably going to get guilt-tripped into coming to a thing at Powell's and listening to it and buying that book, but I would never read that book that he's talking about writing. And I would like to tell you that this book is written for anybody who thought that this book is written for you. I tried to make it. The Numerati don't need this book. They already know what they're doing. This is for the people that don't really know that much about what the Numerati are up to. And so I tried to make it fun. The idea for this book came up at a Business Week meeting where I pitched the cover story on America's tech industry. And what I said was that the United States tech industry was going to decline because we were graduating fewer engineers than India and China and other key countries. We were behind in broadband, behind in wireless. So I had this whole thesis about why our tech industry was going to decline. I thought it's a really important story, and I delivered it with passion, and the editors all yawned. They said, "We've heard that story before. It sounds like Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. Give us something new." So I said, "Well, it's actually really important, so let's talk about it." So we talked about it. And one of the editors finally said, "You know, at the heart of all of these strategic issues is math." And at that point, the editor-in-chief's eyes lit up. And he said, "Math? We could do a cover story on math. Nobody writes about math. People will buy that." And so the science editor said, "Well, we have a couple people on staff, despite the fact that most journalists don't know anything about math. We have a couple who actually do." And the editor-in-chief said, no, let's give it to a less brainy person. So I got the assignment, and I began digging around in the world of math. I went to MIT, I went to Carnegie Mellon, I talked to mathematicians at Bell Labs. They were talking to me about factoring and all these things that were very new to me. And after about a month, I realized I didn't have any story. I really didn't know much about math, and I certainly didn't know enough to write a story for Business Week. And then I went to IBM Research. And at IBM, I met a guy who's a mathematician, a Syrian mathematician, whose specialty is stochastic analysis, which I didn't really understand. I didn't know what that was. But he told me that what he was doing, he and his team were gathering all kinds of data from 50,000 of their colleagues, and they were trying to build predictive mathematical models of their colleagues so that they could predict what their colleagues would do, which jobs they'd do the best, which teams they'd work best in. And I thought, if these guys can model their colleagues, I only vaguely knew what a model was, then other people in other realms might be able to model us as shoppers and voters and patients and potential terrorists. And the whole thing came into focus for me. And I attained what I consider a state of ignorant euphoria. I said, I am going to write the ultimate story on the mathematical modeling of humanity. And I called up my old college roommate who has a a PhD in computer science. And I got his voicemail. And I said, Neil, I just got out of IBM. I just learned about this project they're doing. I'm going to do the mathematical modeling of humanity. It's going to be a National Magazine award-winning story. And I went on and on for maybe 2 minutes into his voicemail, and then I hung up and forgot that I'd made that call. And a couple weeks later, I was on the West Coast, and I was going to go see Google, and I was in my car, and I get this call from my roommate. And he says, I'm very worried about that story you told me about. I said, why? He said, have you ever heard of garbage in, garbage out? I'd heard the term. He said, have you ever heard the story about the drunk who's looking for a key under a lamppost? I imagine some of you have heard this story, but I'll tell it for those who haven't. There's a drunk who's on his hands and knees late at night under a lamppost, and somebody stops and says, what are you looking for? He says, my key. And they said, where did you drop it? And he points down a dark alley and says, over there. And they said, well, why are you looking here? He said, because this is where the light is. And the idea for data mining is that people might use the data that they can find, even though it doesn't represent the truth and it's not that important, and they'll use that because they have it at hand. And that's what Neil was telling me. So a half hour later, I'm at Google, and I'm talking to Craig Silverstein, who is the #1 employee at Google. He was the guy that Larry and Sergey hired because he knew about search and they didn't. So I'm talking to him, and I say, do you know that story about the drunk and the key and the lamppost? He goes, of course I know that story. Is it relevant to what I'm doing? He said, well, let me just tell you a story. When I was in middle school, and this is Google's #1 employee, I did this science fair experiment, and I came up with this fabulous data. And then I realized that the experiment was flawed. So I had to come up with another experiment that would fit the data that I already had. I said, okay, this guy works for Google. If the mathematical modeling of humanity is going to happen, it's going to happen first in areas where people can afford to make lots and lots of mistakes. And so it's going to happen in areas like marketing and advertising, where if you don't understand somebody, you think you have them all figured out, and you give them an advertisement, and it's not right for them at all. But who cares? It's not a big deal. And if in those industries like Google, you do it just a little bit better than the people before you, you can make a lot of money. Google makes a lot of money trying to understand us and giving us the advertisements that they think fit us. And some of them, as you know, are just ludicrous. But enough of them work so that they make a ton of money and have become a giant in advertising and in computers. So despite Neil's caution and Craig's story, I actually believe my original thesis. I believe that we are going into this mathematical modeling of humanity, and that these people who I call the Numerati are looking at our data, and what they're looking at now are just trickles of data compared to the rivers that we're going to be creating in the coming decades as we surround ourselves with more and more electronics, and we carry them, and there's sensors around the world, and we'll carry around the iPhone and other things that we can't yet imagine. They're going to send reports of what we're interested in, where we are, what we're feeling, what we're buying. It's just going to be an enormous amount of information about human behavior. And the Numerati are going to figure us out, little by little. They're not going to get it. They're never going to figure out the entire complexity of us, but they're going to get closer and closer through the decades. You know, people say, what's so different now? There have always been people who analyze data. They've always analyzed humans. Why is this different? What's different now is that if you wanted to understand me or any one of you in the year 1992, you would have to go into your attic and dig through boxes and boxes of letters and journals and receipts if you kept them and tax records, and then you have to go call your friends and your relatives, and you basically have to be like a private eye or a biographer, and each one of us would require that kind of scrutiny to understand our lives and put it together. And now, so much of what we're doing is in ones and zeros and lying in big databases, whether it's clicks on the internet, telephone calls we make, what we buy with our credit cards. And so for the first time, we have delivered enormous amounts of information about our lives to the only people that can make sense of it, and I call them the Numerati. And this book looks at them, and this book is sort of my odyssey as I meet them and explore how they're understanding us in different walks of our lives as shoppers and voters, etc. So I thought I'd give you some examples of what I learned on the trip. For the medicine chapter, I actually came here to Portland. And at Intel Corp, they're wiring the homes of a number of elderly people who have agreed to participate in this experiment with all kinds of sensors. And they measure everything that you can possibly measure about a person's life. They measure the patterns that they make as they walk around the house on a daily and weekly basis, the strength of their voice, the amount of time it takes the person to recognize a known voice on the telephone. They have this thing called the magic carpet, which tries to measure the way people are standing, how they're distributing their weight on the kitchen floor. They have... Misha, what are some of the other things? Yeah, mobility. Oh, yes, mobility sensors to do the strides. You know, the strides as their weight and the length of their strides as they walk through the house. Everything you can possibly measure. And the idea of this is to establish what they call a baseline for every person, so that if there's a change, if there's a deviation from the pattern, then it clues you in that something has changed and maybe it deserves a look. Eventually, what they want to be able to do is automatically analyze that data so that they can come up with a diagnosis and say, this person looks like she's coming down with Parkinson's disease. This person is showing signs of Alzheimer's. This person looks like he's losing muscle mass and might be in danger of having a fall. That's what they want to do eventually, but that's a long way away. In the short term, what this can do is just provide data on very, very simple things, but that still tell us a lot of important information about a person's life. One thing that they need to follow is people's weight. And my mother actually participated in some of the cognitive work that you do there. But she was told when she was 90 years old and extremely frail and suffering from congestive heart failure, she was told that she should weigh herself every day. So I went over to Lloyd Center, at the Sears at Lloyd Center, and I bought her one of these digital scales. And I brought it back kind of knowing it would never work. Because, first of all, I didn't count on her to remember that she was going to weigh herself every day. Secondly, if you have one of those digital scales, you have to give it a good authoritative tap to activate it. And she had a hell of a time double-clicking on the computer, and I knew she wasn't going to be able to tap that scale. And then even if she'd remembered to buy the scale and had summoned up what she needed to tap it and activate it, I didn't think she'd be able to see how much she weighed. So there were big data collection issues there. Now, one thing you can do is you can wire a bed, and the bed tells you how much the person weighs. And so that's a really simple thing. But even then, sometimes there are complications in the data. One night, a woman appeared to gain 8 pounds overnight. So, what is this accumulation of fluids? Should an ambulance be sent over there? Well, it turned out her dog had jumped on her bed. So there's some complications there. But if you think about the medical, what they're doing with medicine. It's instead of reporting once every year for 10 or 15 minutes to a doctor and trying to remember everything that's happened to you in the year and what's gone on and what it means, it's changing everything. And it's saying, we're going to provide steady streams of data that describe our behavior and our symptoms. And that could really change medicine, and it could also change the insurance industry. Because think about if your insurer says to you, I'll give you a 30% reduction in your insurance if you agree to install some of this machinery in your house. Would you do it? If the economy tanks in the next week or two, would you consider it? Well, that's the thing. If you trust the insurance company, it's a big question. And, are they going to use the data to jack up your rates if they see patterns that don't look good? But there are car insurers that are already doing this. There's one in Cleveland called Progressive Insurance that is offering people a discount if they put a black box in their car. And the black box monitors where you go, if you go through dangerous neighborhoods, what time of day and night you drive, how fast you drive, if you're a fast accelerator. Eventually it could be tied up to breathalyzers in the car. I mean, there's all kinds of data that can be gathered to monitor our behavior, and we are going to be offered economic enticements to participate in these programs. And some of us may say, well, not for me, but for my kid. Or not for me, but for my parents. And I think a lot of these things are going to start with adults looking out for those people that they feel responsible for, and foisting these things on those people, but then saying, geez, I really wouldn't mind it if I found out a week before my stroke that I'm going to get a stroke, and maybe I'll wire myself up with a couple of those things too. And so there's a lot of good that can come out of this, a lot of danger, but those are the choices that we're going to be facing in it, and it's a lot of good stuff and a lot of a little bit scary stuff. But the Numerati are right in the middle of it because they're analyzing it all. At work, every keystroke on your computer that you do at work belongs to your boss. Every mouse click belongs to your boss. If you get a BlackBerry, all that traffic belongs to your boss. If you surf the net, that belongs to your boss. I was just at Intel this afternoon up in Hillsborough, and they've set up this lounge for workers there, and they have these Wii machines, these Nintendo Wii, and she said, people have a lot of fun on them. Of course, they know exactly how long we each play on it. So at IBM, they're looking at all this information to try to figure out how each worker can be as good as they can be. And again, it sounds a little bit big brotherly, but in factories, for 100 years, they've been looking at workers and trying to figure out exactly how they move and trying to optimize their behavior so that they can get more productivity out of them. It's a thing called Taylorism that went through all of the 20th century. It was perfected in the Japanese auto plants where they have continuous quality control and lots of data, but they never had the data of knowledge workers. It was really difficult to measure how knowledge workers work and to optimize them. But as we work more on the computer, they can study us more. And at IBM, they're talking about looking at email patterns. And they say they're not doing this now, but if you look at email patterns, you can figure out which network each person belongs in, who that person communicates the most with, who's the big influencer in that network. That might be a really important employee. Who are the outliers in a network? These are people that don't seem to be communicating as much as everyone else. Are they disgruntled? Are they depressed? Are they looking for another job? They can draw all kinds of conclusions about this through the statistical analysis of our email behavior. And IBM was, I did an excerpt of the work chapter on IBM as a Business Week cover story about a month ago, and IBM was very concerned that it made them look like they were acting like Big Brother, and they assured me that it's just a pilot study and it's not all the employees and all the rest, but they were extremely concerned about it. And so just a week ago, I was at Google's New York office, and I was talking to them, and I said to them, you know, IBM people were really worried about the appearance that they'd be Big Brother if they look at everybody's data, but you guys at Google, you must assume that they're looking at your data. They're not dumb enough not to look at your data at Google. I mean, that's what they do. They look at data. Wouldn't you look at what the employees are doing? And the Google employees were horrified that I would suggest such a thing. They got up and they talked about Big Brother and evil, and they thought I was evil for even suggesting that their company would do such a thing. So I thought that was interesting. One of the really cool things about what I discovered on this journey was that if you figure out the statistical patterns in one realm, you can move it. Your breakthrough in one realm can move to another that seems entirely unrelated. And it's kind of fun. I went to Microsoft Research, and they have a researcher there named David Hackerman, who's an MD, and he's also a PhD in computer science. That's a friend of yours? And I'll try to make everything I say accurate then. I was going to get carried away, but I'll keep it. Okay. Anyway, so he's an MD, but he's also a computer scientist, a PhD in computer science. And he was working on a program to block spam from email boxes. And so if you want to block spam, you have to understand what are the variables in an email that define it as spam. What are the things that can distinguish that spam from something else? And you have to teach it to a machine. And the machine has to go through billions of these things every minute. So he had to figure that out, but it wasn't enough just to figure out what was spam today. He had to figure out what will spam look like tomorrow and the next day and the next day. Because if you build, no matter how good the filter that you build, the spammers are changing their spam to try to get it past your filter. So you have to anticipate what they're going to do. And in a sense, you have to anticipate the mutations of spam. So that's what he did. And he thought, if I can anticipate the mutations of spam with this algorithm, then maybe I can anticipate the mutations of HIV. So he moved his research from spam into the battle against AIDS. And he's moved his whole team into it. And so Microsoft is now a player in the battle against AIDS. And they haven't come up with a vaccine yet, but they're serious players in that effort. And it's just because the same patterns worked, or showed promise in this case, I guess we should say. I went to Yahoo down in Sunnyvale because Yahoo has gobs and gobs of data about us. They gather 2,500 pieces of data about each of their 250 million users every month. So I'm talking to the head of research there, and he's saying, it is really hard to deal with this much information because there's just so much stuff that can get in the way, and sometimes you wish you didn't have as much information because it just gets confusing and it jams up the computers. And he gave me an example. He said, let's say we find out, or a credit card company or somebody finds out, that you yesterday in Montclair, New Jersey, bought a $9.99 bottle of Portuguese red wine. And we think, let's look at the New York metropolitan area and see who else bought red Portuguese wine last night. So they look, and they see that I'm in Montclair, and I bought one, and there's somebody else in Clifton, and somebody else in Nutley, and there's about 40 people in Newark who bought it. And so they're saying, what do these people have in common? The guy in Montclair, people in Newark. Should we run the numbers? Should we say, look at their incomes? Are their incomes similar? Let's look at their education levels. Are they similar? Voting patterns? There are many different ways to look at those people, and you might come up with some really interesting correlations. They could waste a lot of time doing that. But what's happened is that the people in Newark are Portuguese. And I and my friend and the other people in Nutley and Clifton just happened to be shopping for a cheap bottle of red wine. And so it's an example of how one piece of data can send you what they call down a rat hole, because you can waste a lot of time looking at that one piece of data. So about 3 weeks later, I was at the National Security Agency outside of Washington in Fort Meade, Maryland. And they were very controversial, and they still are, for scooping up massive amounts of our internet traffic and our telephone calls. And they had canceled the interview, or postponed the interview a number of times because they were embroiled in this controversy. And I was talking to the chief mathematician there, and I was very cautious because I didn't know if maybe he'd get upset at asking a question and get up and slam the door, and I didn't know what I could ask him and what I couldn't. So I started off on kind of an innocent footing. I said, I was at Yahoo, and they say that sometimes they get too much data. And is that a problem for you too? Do you get confused by too much data? Does it tie you up in knots? He said, well, the people at Yahoo might not be able to store all that data. They might not ask it intelligent questions. They might get tied up in knots managing all of that data. But no, you can never have too much data. So, that was a chilling moment for me as an American. In the end of my journey, I convinced my wife, Jolaire, who's here tonight, to join me in signing up for chemistry.com. And we tried to see whether the dating service that prided itself on extremely sophisticated algorithms would match two lovers. And we'd been married for 20 years, and we thought, there's a good chance that it'll figure out what we figured out about each other and match us, and that will vindicate its system. So we each entered loads and loads of details about ourselves, some of them very arcane. They ask you, is this finger shorter than this finger, for example? It has something to do with hormones. We entered all that data, and then we looked, and we weren't matched for each other. They suggested many other people for each of us. I was especially concerned because they matched Jolaire with this guy on the far side of JFK Airport who seemed like, a person to be taken seriously. And he was. If you look at Google Maps, it takes about an hour and a half to go from Montclair to JFK Airport if you don't run into any traffic along the way. And so he must have been spectacular, this person. But I didn't understand how he could be so special and so much superior to the other candidate for her affection in the same town who actually lived in the same house. And so I thought something must be wrong. And so I went back and I looked at the data that I had given chemistry.com, and there was just one little piece of data where I had screwed up. And when I fixed it, Jolaire popped right up on my screen, and I felt really great about that. And so even though the Numerati are wading through oceans and oceans and oceans of our data, sometimes just one piece can be crucial.
You've been listening to journalist and author Stephen Baker talking about his first book, The Numerati. In a moment, we'll return to the questions from the audience. For the past 20 years, Stephen Baker has written for Business Week magazine, covering Mexico and Latin America, the Rust Belt, technology, and a range of other topics. To find out more about Stephen Baker and his work, please visit his website at www.thenumerati.net. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Stephen Baker spoke at Powell's City of Books in Portland, Oregon on September 25th, 2008.
So those are my remarks. I'd be happy to answer any, answer any questions you have about the book.
The first question for the author was how he changed his profile to change the outcome for the dating service.
I used to hold it back because I would hope everybody would buy the book to find out. But I'm not. What? Okay, I'll try to come up with a way to make it sound good. Jalaire is just a tiny bit older than I am. And I pegged the... I was looking for a younger woman.
Tell us about the guy on the other side of the
Yeah, we have to find out about that guy. Jalaire's a horticulturist, and he talked about growing roses on thorny, in rocky soil or something, and so I thought that was... Yes?
The next question for the author was whether, in his research, he had found any organizations that had been able to gather enough data to actually start profiling individuals. Are there enough data available to allow them to profile individuals?
Well, okay. Enough is the key word there. There's enough to do there's enough to do things that are valuable to them and can make them a lot of money, and that can understand us a little bit better in one realm or another than the previous state of the art. And so if you can get that incremental improvement, then it justifies doing it. Although compared to how they're going to understand us in the future, right now they see us as kind of stick figures. It's kind of primitive. And it's also not brought together in a lot of sophisticated ways so that they can look at how shoppers and look at the complete person, because we're each all of these things. And so they have a long way to go. One area where they are really trying to figure us out in a more complete way is as voters. And there, I talked to this company called Spotlight, which has divided all voting age Americans into 10 tribes. And these tribes, as they define them, have to do with our deepest values, what we feel about righteousness, community, freedom. These are really squishy things, and it sounds like BS, I know. But they went through long interviews with a few thousand people and came up with this understanding. And then they looked for the correlations between these various tribes and politics. And as you can imagine, the righteous people tended to be on the right and the community people tended to be on the left. But what they want is to focus on is the swing groups in the middle. And a lot of them had to do with freedom. And they found one swing group that they call barn raisers, who really care deeply about fairness and about people playing by the rules, and they're very indignant about people cheating. And these people, there are 14 million of them by their calculations, and these people voted 90% for President Bush in 2004, and then swung 50 to 60% for the Democrats in the 2006 elections. So they think this is an important swing group. But the interesting thing about this is these people, you cannot say they're white, black, rich, poor, suburban. They're all of that. They're scattered among all of these old groupings that we had, but they have this one attitude about right and wrong in common. And so the question then is, how do you find them? You've interviewed a few thousand people, and you've determined that those people represent Americans, but how do you find 5,000 of these barn raisers in Milwaukee? Well, what they do is they look at all the data that they have about the people they've interviewed. They've got demographic data, voting data, and a ton of consumer data about these people. And then they build up a statistical model of the typical barn raiser, mixing in all these elements. Some of the big ones are where they live, how much money they make. Some of the little ones are whether they have cats or dogs or what kinds of cars they drive or magazines they subscribe to. So they build these models of these people, and then they go through all of us, 175 million Americans of voting age, and they put us into these various tribes. So we are all sitting in databases as members of these 10 groups, and some of the people here, statistically speaking, are bound to be barn raisers. And if Oregon is a swing state in this election, you may recognize that you're a barn raiser when you get some kind of advertisement, direct advertisement from a Democratic candidate that stresses right and wrong and playing by the rules and integrity and things like that. So,
one audience member asked if the Republicans might use the same model in their campaign advertisements.
Well, if they could, and they might. I mean, the only group that I reported on that I got really good access with was this Democratic group. And there's this arms race for this micro-targeting. And I should say the micro-targeting is only for the fraction of the people who they think could swing really close elections. They stick by the tried and true of the television and the standard methods for the 48% on each side that are going to go one way or the other. But they want to focus on tiny little swing voters in swing states. And it's really expensive. Yeah.
The next audience member asked if there was any legislation that would regulate this kind of data gathering, or any members of Congress that are concerned about the issues of privacy associated with this kind of data gathering.
There are lots of people that are very concerned about it. There are companies that see it as a great opportunity, because if you can, there are lots of benefits to this. And if you can create a technology that helps people protect their own data and figure out and dole it out to people that they trust, then you could have a really huge market. And so IBM and Microsoft are working on those kinds of software systems, and others are, I'm sure. I think that there is going to be some big scandal about some invasion of privacy that's going to really get people's attention, and it could push the politicians to, pass some laws. And then I worry that the laws might be clumsy enough to block the good stuff and leave the bad stuff unaffected. That would be my concern about the laws. One more thing just about privacy. People, as I find, generally say they're really concerned about privacy, but if you offer them a discount on their food at the supermarket, they'll gladly let you know what they eat. If they can save a lot of time at the toll booth by with an automatic pass, they'll use that. And I think, and if you look at what happened after 9/11. We sacrificed a lot of our privacy with the Patriot Act in order for the illusion or the promise of being secure. And so safety, convenience, and economic gains sometimes trump our concern about privacy. Yeah, Mar.
The next member of the audience observed that she had been referred by a friend to check out their Facebook page, and that in order to do so, she was required to register with Facebook. It was only a few years ago that we were all very concerned with the passage of the Patriot Act, the suspension of our constitutional rights, and that information about us would fall into the hands of government agencies. And yet now there is an entire generation of young people who are making much more information about themselves available through their computers.
Well, I think there's a real generational difference here. And so when you talk about what we as Americans want about privacy, a 20-year-old has much different feelings than a 60-year-old in that. And I think the 20-year-olds have more power, and the Numerati benefit greatly from that, because there's just this avalanche of data. Yeah. You.
The next audience member observed that all of these technologies seem to depend on people being predictable. It seems like the examples given by the author describe people whose behavior is predictable and therefore modelable.
Well, I don't think individuals are not predictable, but groups are more predictable. And so if you look at a group of barn raisers and you say there are 14 million, and you send out advertisements to each one of them, and you've thought it out well, and the advertisements are correctly focused on those 14 million, a certain number of them will be wrong, a certain number of them won't pay attention to it, but the thinking is that a certain number of them will work. Statistically, it's likely that a certain number of them work, and it'll work better than the mass appeal. Right. And so you're right. A person, an individual, is highly unpredictable. Yeah.
The next question asked about the tone of the conversations that the author had with representatives from the National Security Agency, the NSA.
Oh, extremely friendly. I'll tell you, one of the things that, he's really interested in the challenge. They have the biggest math shop in the world at the NSA, and they really have great interest in solving these issues. And they have interest in what they're doing. And they also, they think that they helped us win the Cold War. We were in a math war with the Russians for 40 years. And before that, we were in a math war with the Germans. The whole Enigma machine, the decoding, that was all mathematicians heroically working on our behalf. And so they look at themselves as heirs to this great tradition of mathematicians trying to protect us. And most of them, this isn't like torture or something. These people are real. There might be, the decisions that are made to invade our privacy are not made by the mathematicians. They're made by policymakers. And the mathematicians just get this stuff and analyze it. Now, a lot of them mistakes can be made. But it was a friendly talk. The one real problem that the NSA has is that they have to compete with IBM and Google and Microsoft for mathematicians. And that's really hard because they can't pay that kind of money, and they can't give them stock options. And what's worse is the NSA is limited to American mathematicians. And that's a really tough constraint in the global market. Yeah.
The next question for the author was how he would rate the risk from the manipulation that he described earlier, and the use of these technologies in more direct forms of control. This member of the audience mentioned the Chinese government's security apparatus used during the Olympics, including video surveillance and face recognition technologies. In London, for example, you'll see surveillance cameras everywhere. It seems that governments can potentially know where everyone is at any time.
That's right.
How would you rate the risks of these technologies?
I think that we are moving into a situation where we are going to be monitored much more and under more control of corporations and the government. I do. It's just the way it's going, because we are going to be surrounded with these kinds of tools. And you could say, "Oh, I'd like to go off the grid," but it's really hard to participate in modern life off the grid. It's hard to work. You can't get a job. Imagine if you're trying to get a job like in elder care or something like that. You don't have a cell phone, and your competitor does. You're not going to get the call. Yeah.
The next question was whether the author had changed anything about his own behavior in light of what he had learned in researching his book.
I'm just a trusting, sloppy, data-gorging animal. I haven't changed a thing. I blog, I use my supermarket card and the Easy Pass, and I carry the cell phone, and I do the BlackBerry. And no, I haven't changed one thing. Well, the only thing I've changed is that I'm aware. It intrigues me. I wonder how they're using that. I wonder what that looks like. But I haven't really changed a thing, no. Yeah. Yeah.
The next audience member asked whether the author had, in his research for the book, run into people who were actively discussing ethics, the fundamental assumptions underlying this work, and considering and speculating on the possible consequences of this kind of data gathering and analysis.
Meaningful silence here. Well, I ran into those discussions at IBM when they were talking about modeling the worker, because it got very big brotherly and kind of scary, and we talked about what was in the worker's best interests. Now, that's not really ethics. I've got to say that I did not have, and this may be my fault, but I didn't have deep ethical discussions about this thing along this journey with too many people. But I also would say that these people who are involved in this kind of research, almost to a person, think that they're doing a very good thing for us. That we are, I mean, if you think about our ancestors in the 19th century living in small towns where everybody knew everything about everybody. And then the rich people had custom service. They had butlers who knew their most intimate secrets. And other people weren't quite so lucky. The grocer behind the counter knew about what you bought every week. He knew whether you were kosher or not. He knew whether to offer you the bottle of vodka when you were shopping with your wife. He knew all these things. And then we entered a period after World War II when it was the industrialization of the consumer society, when all of a sudden we're handed shopping carts and told we can go through and do that work, and we were treated more or less like ants. And that might go down as the golden period of privacy in America. I think we're returning to the older days, but it's machines that are doing it instead of people. But I'm sorry, as far as the ethics goes, that's a very good question, and I did not have really great discussions about it. Yeah.
The next audience member observed that if these data technologies were to develop appropriately, we would be offered the things that we want.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying is that when these people think they're doing great things, and I think in many cases they are. There's a downside to it. There's a downside there's privacy. I mean, in the workplace, IBM is trying to. If you ask them what they're doing, they say, we are trying to make the job as exciting as possible for these people, because if they're not interested in their job, they're not going to come up with good ideas, and they're not going to be changing they're not going to be as productive as we want. So they talk about really building systems that understand and coddle and support their high-level intelligence workers. The ones who fare much worse in this scheme are the workers that they call commodities, who fit much more into the factory paradigm. And those people are either going to be treated like machines or replaced by machines, as I see it. And that's the downside. Yes?
The next audience member returned to the question of marketing. When data analysts look at one or another group, are any of these groups easier to sell to? For example, all of these young people on MySpace and Facebook, all of their data are available. And then you have older folks, people in their 30s, 40s, and older, who may not use computers as much or in the same ways. Is there a particular demographic that works well for these analysts, that makes it easy for them to market to, easy to sell?
I don't know if there is. I mean, I looked at supermarket shoppers and the patterns that supermarket shoppers make, and that didn't have to do with generations, but they can look at a supermarket shopper and determine whether a person is on a budget or not, right? That's pretty easy. If the person spends between $198 and $202 every week, that person's on a budget. So then, if a person's on a budget, do you offer that person anything that's on sale? No. You want them to pay full price for everything because they're only going to spend $200. You want it to be all full price, right? So you don't offer those people anything on sale. Then you can determine who is loyal to brands. That person keeps buying the Heinz ketchup even though the Hunt's has a 20% reduction. Okay, so that person's loyal to brands. Is she only loyal to ketchup brands, or is it just a brand loyal person? If it's a brand loyal person, can you afford to raise the prices on certain brands for them? You can come to all kinds of conclusions. But, another one that I thought was especially intriguing. You know when you check out of the supermarket and they have those candy bars? They found that those impulsive little candy bar purchases for many people they do that much more religiously than buying milk and eggs. So then you can start looking at the candy bar people and saying, what can we learn about the so-called impulsive candy bar people? Are there other patterns that they have that we can take advantage of? I didn't answer your question, Dan, I know.
Well, I just wondered, because
Yeah.
see.
The next audience member asked about the younger people who share information through their computers. Are they brand loyal? Can these companies really use that data effectively in their marketing to these kids?
Well, okay. In the chapter the chapter in my book where I talk about analyzing blogs and social networks is this company called Umbria Communications, and what they do is they go through millions and millions of blog posts, and they've taught the computer to read each blog post in a fraction of a second, maybe 100 blog posts in a second, and in that time they can distinguish by the patterns of the blogs, the words chosen, the fonts, the exclamation points, the smiley faces, all the variables in the blog. They can determine the approximate age and gender of the blogger, and also whether that person has a positive or negative view on Microsoft's Jerry Seinfeld commercials or Barack Obama's latest speech. And so they're doing market research on that, but they're not looking at the individuals. They're just looking at and they get a lot of them wrong. They're just looking at the group so that they can give the consumer products companies a read on what the bloggers are thinking. Or no, what people are thinking. Yes?
The next audience member referred back to the observation that the mathematicians do not make the policy decisions about what information to collect and how to collect it. But, he asked, wouldn't the policymakers have to rely upon the analysts and the mathematicians to make decisions about what they need to fine-tune their research, what they need to deliver what is being asked of them by the policymakers?
Well, at the NSA, each team has a spy or intelligence officer who instructs them about what they're looking for. And then they have some statisticians, data miners, mathematicians, and then they have anthropologists and other people like that, because they're looking through data from foreign countries and they don't really understand these patterns. And that's one of the real problem. In the book, one of the areas of least promise that I talk about is hunting terrorists through the patterns of their behavior. Because we don't understand, we don't know the patterns of their behavior. We have terrible data on that. We are really, really good at understanding serial buyers and really bad on bombers. And the real danger is that in our zeal to catch the bombers, we say, we need more. We don't have it yet. We need more. Is there any patterns here that show anything? That's the dangerous stuff, because it's uninformed and there's not good data. Yeah.
The next audience member asked whether the fact that people seem to know that their information is being collected, that the fact that we know all of our purchases are being monitored, that our knowing about it provides the transparency that privacy advocates think is needed.
Well, I think one of the things they have to really take into account is that people try to game every system that they can possibly game, and we've done that long before the digital age. That's just what we do as animals. And so the smart ones try to figure out how it can be gamed, and they try to look at things that are less voluntary. But I think they have to consider that only a certain percentage is really actively trying to game systems. Then they can allow for that statistically. Yeah.
The next question for the author was whether anybody that he wanted to interview for the book declined his request for an interview.
The founders of Google didn't give me an interview. But I have to say that people are really proud of, the people that I talked to in this book are proud of the work that they're doing, and really didn't seem to have that much to want to hide. And, you know, of course they knew about the privacy concerns and whatnot, but, you know, they believe in what they're doing. They're offering customized smart service. A lot of times they are. That's what their goal is, and they're making tons of money. But, so no, I didn't get into that situation. You know, I'm a Business Week reporter. If I were a reporter for Mother Jones, I think I would have had trouble. I think working for Business Week helped me a lot in that area. Because I think they thought, well, you know, the guy, you know, he writes about business. Yeah.
The next audience member suggested that the author should write a book about how to stay off the grid, how to avoid being monitored by these data technologies.
Well, everybody who buys it would have to pay cash, right? Right. Yeah.
The next question was about the several privacy advocacy groups that are active on these kinds of issues. Are these groups taken seriously by the folks interviewed by the author?
Well, most of the people I interviewed are researchers. I wasn't dealing a lot with the executives at the top of companies who have to deal with those sorts of strategic issues. The only executives I dealt with are founders of startups. And so, you know, I think there are some policy, like at IBM, there have to be policy people that are thinking about this all the time. But I didn't talk to them. I talked to the researchers. So, yeah.
The next audience member asked about the word usage and language analysis done on blogs. Were there other aspects of that work that the author found particularly interesting that may not have been included in the book?
They're doing all kinds of things about that, and my friends here in Oregon are looking at the word usage to indicate signs of senility. So I hope that nobody finds that my word usage towards the end of the book is. But, you know, there are all kinds of experiments that are being done, and analysis is being done to look into the cognitive state of people based on the word choices that they make. You can also figure out that the age of a person, older people tend to use more words than younger people, so you can look at the words in a blog, and by the word choice you can figure out who's older and who's not. Statistically, not they can't nail the individuals, but just statistically. But I think what's really interesting is that this is just beginning, and there is going, if a company like Umbria now can just give us a thumbs up or thumbs down with a whole lot of false positives on what people think in a blog about one thing, in a number of years, they're going to be able to understand the nuance and context and meaning of what we write. And much of what we write is going to be on the networks. So it's like all of human words are going to be open for analysis to understand our thoughts and not just our intentions. And so I think there's tremendous amount of data that's going to be available for analysis as they get better and better at this. And also our spoken words. Yeah, right. Yeah.
The next audience member asked if the author thought that the power of these technologies would grow in the exponential way that other computer and electronic technologies have grown.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that it's on an exponential growth. It goes with Moore's law, because the cheaper and more powerful the computing gets, the more of it we surround ourselves with, the more data that we produce that goes on to networks and talks about us. The storage is greater, the network speeds are greater. New networks are going to come up that describe not just our movements, but what's happening on Earth, inside in the oceans and forests, swarms of birds. All of that stuff is going to be added so that it's a picture not just of what humans are doing, but what the whole Earth is doing. And, here's another interesting point, I think. The growth of our data is faster than the growth of our computing power. So we are producing more data. Moore's law cannot keep up with the growth of our data. So the only thing that can bridge the gap so that people can interpret the data that we're producing is smarter and smarter algorithms. It has to be humans figuring out how to analyze it, because that's a shortcut for the machines. Yeah.
The next audience member asked if there were particular areas of mathematics that the author found especially interesting in his research for the book.
I don't know anything about math. No, I'm serious. What I really liked is statistics, and I like statistics because I can at least understand what they're talking about. And when I started this book, I really thought, okay, I'm a guy from the word world, and I'm going to go into the world of this numbers people. And it's like, I've been a foreign correspondent in my life, and I thought it was that kind of a job. But when I sat down with people and they told me what they were doing, the process is just the way humans think. We always think in terms of, we weigh variables. Let's say a neighbor comes up to you and knocks on your door and asks you for a $100 loan. You start thinking about that neighbor. What do you know about that neighbor? Does that neighbor have a brother who's in jail? Has the neighbor paid back loans before? Does the neighbor's mother go to your mother's church? You have all of these different variables, and what you're doing as you decide in that fraction of a second whether to say yes or no is you're weighing the importance of each of these variables. How much does it matter what his brother does? How much does it matter what his mother does? How much does it matter that he's good looking or bad looking? You're analyzing all these things, and some of it's subconscious, but at least you're going through the process of analyzing variables. And in every industry I talk to, that's what they're taught. That's what these statisticians are doing. They're analyzing variables and saying, how important is it that this person tosses a candy bar into the basket? So I found it really easy to understand at that level. But then there's all this math that I haven't a clue, frankly. Yeah. No, I didn't, because everybody assumes that the quants run Wall Street, and everybody thought that was familiar, and we wanted to write about something that seemed new. And what's really changed with the internet is all this human activity that's going onto the networks, and so we really focused on that. I wish I'd focused on Wall Street a little bit, because I could provide more intelligent answers now when people ask me about it. Yeah.
The next audience member asked whether there were cases where the analysts found a particular algorithm that would work for a particular demographic, but that they did not understand why it worked.
I can't think of one where I came across that. I mean, there are these things called neural networks, which process vast amounts of data, come up with patterns, and do exactly what you're saying. And the real problem with neural networks is they don't know why. And so you can't do what Heckerman did and move to a different domain based on neural networks, because you can't understand what's at its base. And they talk about that some, but I didn't really dig into that much. Yeah.
The next question was about individuals who go through some sort of specific change in their lives, such as a religious experience or getting married, so that their patterns of behavior also change significantly. How would these sorts of changes affect the work of these data and market analysts?
Well, the people change, their patterns change, and if you're smart, you see the change in their patterns, and you start marketing to them differently.
That member of the audience followed up, asking about a person who was particularly enlightened or living spontaneously, living in the moment, responding to their environment.
You know what you'd be doing for the next several months?
What's that?
What you would be doing for the next several months is madly throwing away all the junk mail that no longer applies to you.
Yeah.
Not that it applies to you now, but even less then, right?
But it just got me curious because it makes everybody almost sound a little lemony.
Well, statistically we are a little lemony, or at least enough so that they can make money believing that we are.
Right. Yeah.
But one thing I should say, and it's a really important point, is that these people that analyze us statistically cannot predict big surprising things, the so-called black swans. And anybody who tries to fool themselves into thinking that you can predict the big surprises based on what happened yesterday runs into trouble. Yeah.
One member of the audience suggested that this was like Bill James insisting that Gary Reedus was going to be the next Hank Aaron.
That's exactly right. Didn't happen. He had a couple good years, though, for the Reds. I think that might be about it, huh? Thank you so much.
You've been listening to journalist and author Stephen Baker talking about his first book, The Numerati. To find out more about Stephen Baker and his work, please visit his website at www.thenumerati.net. This program was produced by PDxjustice Media Productions. To find out more about our work, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find free streaming video and audio programs on a broad range of topics, including economics, globalization, war and peace, human rights, and science. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.
Do you know that story about the drunk and the key and the lamppost? Of course I know that story. Is it relevant to what I'm doing? He said, well, let me just tell you a story. When I was in middle school, and this is Google's #1 employee, I did this science fair experiment, and I came up with this fabulous data. And then I realized that the experiment was flawed. So I had to come up with another experiment that would fit the data that I already had. I said, okay, this guy works for Google. If the mathematical modeling of humanity is going to happen, it's going to happen first in areas where people can afford to make lots and lots of mistakes. And so it's going to happen in areas like marketing and advertising, where if you don't understand somebody, you think you have them all figured out, and you give them an advertisement, and it's not right for them at all. But who cares? It's not a big deal. And if in those industries like Google, you do it just a little bit better than the people before you, you can make a lot of money. Google makes a lot of money trying to understand us and giving us the advertisements that they think fit us. And some of them, as you know, are just ludicrous. But enough of them work so that they make a ton of money and have become a giant in advertising and in computers. So, despite Neil's caution and Craig's story, I actually believe my original thesis. I believe that we are going into this mathematical modeling of humanity, and that these people who I call the Numerati are looking at our data, and what they're looking at now are just trickles of data compared to the rivers. I'm so happy to be at PALS where they're giving it terrific table space. It's the first time I've seen it, and I really appreciate it. When I told people that I was working on this book, I could tell that they were thinking two things. Steve must really know a lot of math and data stuff, A, and B, at some point, I'm probably going to get guilt-tripped into coming to a thing at PALS and listening to it and buying that book, but I would never read that book that he's talking about writing. And I would like to tell you that this book is written for anybody who thought that this book is written for you. I tried to make it. The Numerati don't need this book. They already know what they're doing. This is for the people that don't really know that much about what the Numerati are up to. And so I tried to make it fun. The idea for this book came up at a Business Week meeting where I pitched the cover story on America's tech industry. And what I said was that the United States tech industry was going to decline because we were graduating fewer engineers than India and China and other key countries. We were behind in broadband, behind in wireless. So I had this whole thesis about why our tech industry was going to decline. I thought it's a really important story, and I delivered it with passion. And the editors all yawned. They said, we've heard that story before. It sounds like Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. Give us something new. So I said, well, it's actually really important, so let's talk about it. So we talked about it, and one of the editors finally said, you know, at the heart of all of these strategic issues is math. And at that point, the editor-in-chief's eyes lit up, and he said, math? Thank you. Testing 1, 2, 3. Thank you. You know, I dreamed for decades about writing a book, and I thought it would just be the greatest thing to write a book and walk into a bookstore and see the book that I had written. And when I found that my office is in New York on Rockefeller Center on 6th Avenue, and when I heard that the book had shown up in the Barnes & Noble, because we don't have pals in Manhattan, in the Barnes & Noble on 5th Avenue, I made my way over there, and I walked in, and I found my book, and I immediately was so disappointed because it wasn't on one of these tables. I think that you can dream about something, and when you get it, my satisfaction lasted about as long as a Beatles song from like the early Beatles, before they started singing long songs, because immediately I just began thinking about what was wrong and how unhappy I was. And so my old college roommate, who has a PhD in computer science, and I got his voicemail, and I said, Neil, I just got out of IBM. I just learned about this project they're doing. I'm going to do the mathematical modeling of humanity. It's going to be a National Magazine award-winning story. And I went on and on for maybe 2 minutes into his voicemail, and then I hung up and forgot that I'd made that call. And a couple weeks later, I was on the West Coast, and I was going to go see Google, and I was in my car, and I get this call from my roommate. And he says, I'm very worried about that story you told me about. I said, why? He said, have you ever heard of garbage in, garbage out? I'd heard the term. He said, have you ever heard the story about the drunk who's looking for a key under a lamppost? I imagine some of you have heard this story, but I'll tell it for those who haven't. There's a drunk who's on his hands and knees late at night under a lamppost, and somebody stops and says, what are you looking for? He says, my key. And they said, where did you drop it? And he points down a dark alley and says, over there. And they said, well, why are you looking here? He said, because this is where the light is. And the idea for data mining is that people might use the data that they can find, even though it doesn't represent the truth and it's not that important, and they'll use that because they have it at hand. And that's what Neil was telling me. So a half hour later, I'm at Google, and I'm talking to Craig Silverstein, who is the #1 employee at Google. He was the guy that Larry and Sergey hired because he knew about search and they didn't. So I'm talking to him, and I say, we could do a cover story on math. Nobody writes about math. People will buy that. And so the science editor said, well, we have a couple people on staff, despite the fact that most journalists don't know anything about math. We have a couple who actually do. And the editor-in-chief said, no, let's give it to a less brainy person. So I got the assignment, and I began digging around in the world of math. I went to MIT, I went to Carnegie Mellon, I talked to mathematicians at Bell Labs. They were talking to me about factoring and all these things that were very new to me. And after about a month, I realized I didn't have any story. I really didn't know much about math, and I certainly didn't know enough to write a story for Business Week. And then I went to IBM Research, And at IBM, I met a guy who's a mathematician, a Syrian mathematician, whose specialty is stochastic analysis, which I didn't really understand. I didn't know what that was. But he told me that what he was doing, he and his team were gathering all kinds of data from 50,000 of their colleagues, and they were trying to build predictive mathematical models of their colleagues so that they could predict what their colleagues would do, which jobs they'd do the best, which teams they'd work best in. And I thought, if these guys can model their colleagues, and I only vaguely knew what a model was, then other people in other realms might be able to model us as shoppers and voters and patients and potential terrorists. And the whole thing came into focus for me. And I attained what I consider a state of ignorant euphoria. I said, I am going to write the ultimate story on the mathematical modeling of humanity. And I called up